Here's a list of things to check on your podcast before you launch. Your podcast logo should be 1400 by 1400 pixels square, or a maximum of 3000 by 3000 pixels that's under 1 megabyte. It should also be in a JPEG or PNG format. If your podcast doesn't meet these parameters, there could be issues with your RSS feed being accepted in different directories. Your RSS feed will have a spot where you can list your name or your company's name as the owner of the show. It's always beneficial to have your name here, just in case there are any sorts of dispute issues. This is also one of the many fields that might be required by some directories. Your feed also has a spot for you to input your email address in case you need to be contacted. Some directories will also deny your feed if you don't have an email address listed. Statistics show that your podcast description is the make or break thing between people checking out your podcast and entices listeners to come listen to your show or move on to the next podcast. This is crucial for you to set up before you launch your podcast, but if you have a podcast that's been around for quite some time, there's nothing wrong with updating your description as well. Make sure that your podcast description is well written and matches the tone of your show. This is yet another field that might be required by many directories. You don't have to have a presence on every social media channel, but make sure that before you launch your show that you do have your social media handles in place. It's also a great time to think about what social media channels you're going to use to help you grow and promote your podcast. You should be promoting your podcast before you launch, and using social media is a great way to help you grow your brand. Using social media, you can have friends, family, and potential fans of your show sharing the content before you even launch. This is also a great time to choose your social media handles. That way you can keep the branding across all the different social media platforms consistent for your audience. You might have a podcast that has a really unique name and the handle might not be available in such a long form. For example, Twitter has a shrunk character limit, whereas something like Instagram has a longer character limit. So this gives you the ability to make sure that whatever social media handle you choose is consistent across all of the different platforms that you choose to be on. If you have a podcast website, it's also crucial for you to put your social media handles on your podcast website. You can also put your social media links in the description of your show. I don't recommend putting in the full link, but you can do something akin to Twitter:handle. Something like that. Your teaser episode serves two purposes. It gives your listeners a preview of what your show is going to be about and what your show is going to sound like. It also fulfills the requirement of many directories of having to have at least one episode published before you can submit to their directory. This way, you can ensure that your podcast launch isn't delayed because you have to submit your podcast to the directories. Having that episode trailer already fulfills that requirement, so when you launch your first official episode, your podcast will show up in all the directories that you've submitted your podcast to. As you get ready to launch your podcast, you want to make sure that your podcast is searchable and accessible in as many podcast directories as possible. This ensures that there are as few steps as possible for people to find your podcast in their directory of choice. Someone's trying to find your podcast in the Podbean app, they can find it easily. Someone's trying to find your podcast in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, they'll be able to find it there as well. It's okay to push your podcast launch back until the directories are absolutely ready. This way, you won't have to launch your podcast too soon or get caught in any snags. If you're hosted with Podbean, you can navigate to distribution podcast apps, and we give you an easy way to submit your podcast to all the popular directories such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, and many more. You can also check out our Submit Your Podcast to Podcast directories to see even more podcast directories that you can submit your podcast to. It's recommended to not just launch with one podcast recorded, but to have about 3 or 4 podcast episodes recorded as well. This makes sure that you're not scrambling for content to release for your next episode. This gives you a little bit of breathing room in case you come up with an emergency and can't record your next episode quickly. There are many podcasts who also launch with multiple episodes on the directories as well. If someone likes your first episode, there's a chance that they're going to like your second, third, and following episodes. So launching with a couple of different episodes on the directory at your launch can also help listeners continue to listen to more content once they like your first piece as well. This may seem trivial, but if you're going to have a podcast where you're using explicit language and talking about explicit content, and you've marked your podcast as clean, this might cause issues in some of the directories seeing your podcast and pulling it down. If you're not sure, You can always mark your podcast as non-explicit and then choose the explicit tag for specific episodes when needed. If episodes are mislabeled as non-explicit, if they are explicit, there's a good chance that they're going to get removed from different podcast directories. Found in your feed settings, this number is automatically set to 100. What this means is that the podcast directories are only going to show 100 of your most recent episodes. While this might be trivial for the podcaster who might be on episode 1, 2, or even episode 10, as you grow your podcast, the directories might only show up to 100 of your episodes. If you have over 100 episodes, there will be episodes that aren't listed. Raising that episode limit is one of the things that we recommend to make sure that as you grow your podcast, your content is going to be available over that 100 episode limit. This ensures that your podcast content doesn't get cut off when you hit that 100 limit in the different directories. Check out more of our content here for more awesome podcasting tips and tricks, and check out podbean.com, the easiest way to start a podcast.